He would one day be called a god, a king of kings, a storm that reshaped the world, Alexander the Great. But first he was a boy, born in 356 BC to King Philip II of Macedon, and to a woman who shaped his destiny like a sculptor carves marble. Queen Olympias was no ordinary queen. She was a mystic, a priestess of Dionysus, a keeper of snakes who slept beside them and spoke in omens. And she had a vision. From the moment Alexander could speak, she whispered in his ear, "Your father is not Philip. Your true father is Zeus." And he believed her. Why wouldn't he? By his teens, he was being trained by Aristotle, quoting Homer, and taming wild horses no one else could ride. He wasn't just becoming great, he was being sculpted into a legend. But Olympias didn't stop at divinity. She didn't just whisper, "You're the son of Zeus." She told him he was destined to rule the known world, that Asia, the ancient Persian Empire, was his birthright. Staying in Macedonia would be beneath his legend. It was too small. The true prize, the empire of kings and immortals, lay across the sea. It had to be his. After all, the land he longed to conquer was the same land where Achilles, his hero, had fought and fallen. Alexander didn't just admire Achilles, he worshipped him. His hero, his god. He kept a copy of Homer's Iliad tucked beneath his pillow like a holy text. Achilles had fought and died in Asia Minor, at Troy, where the bones of heroes still whispered through the dust. For young Alexander, conquering that land wasn't just symbolic. It was ritual. It was spiritual. It was deeply personal. A chance to walk in the shadow of his hero and rewrite the ending. But destiny wasn't written in poetry alone. There was unfinished business left behind by blood. His father, Philip II, had been preparing to invade Persia long before his assassination in 336 BC. It wasn't just ambition, it was vengeance, a campaign meant to repay an old debt. Because more than a century earlier, the Persians had left a scar across Greece, at that time called Hellas, that had never fully healed. In 480 BC, the Persian Empire crossed into Hellas, clashing with Sparta at the Battle of Thermopylae, where King Leonidas fell, but bought precious time. That same year, they burned Athens to the ground, a wound that still smoldered in Hellenic memory, and more than a century later was still waiting for fire to answer fire. Alexander didn't just inherit this war from his father, he inherited a grievance, a century-old fire still burning in the heart of Hellas, a pan-Hellenic crusade forged in legacy and flame. He took his father's blueprints and forged them into prophecy, not just for glory, but to avenge the gods, to finish what was started. This wasn't strategy, this was fate, a divine son, a second Achilles born for war. When Alexander stepped onto the shores of Asia Minor, he didn't march straight to war. He made a detour to a ruin. Troy, the city of legends, where the gods once whispered through walls now buried in dust, where Achilles fought, where Hector fell. Alexander came not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim. He walked the crumbled battlements in silence. The wind carried only dust and memory. Then he approached the tomb of Achilles, his childhood idol, his imagined ancestor, his mirror. He laid a wreath upon the mound, and then, following the ancient rite, he stripped off his armor, anointed himself with oil, and ran naked around the tomb, not just in tribute, but in kinship. Plutarch would later write, "He smeared himself with oil and ran a race naked with his companions, as the custom is. Then crowned with a wreath the column which marks the grave of Achilles." He also remarked that Achilles was happy in having found a faithful friend while he lived, and a great poet to sing of his deeds after his death. To Alexander, it wasn't just a ritual. It was a vow to live greatly, die mythically, and be remembered forever. And like the heroes of Homer, he sacrificed to the gods, to Athena, to Zeus, to fate itself. He poured sacred wine into the earth, laid wreaths on ancient stone, and offered the blood of oxen beneath the burning sky, just as Achilles once had. A living man stepping into myth, reenacting the Iliad not as audience, but as heir. Beside him stood Hephaestion, his closest companion. While Alexander honored Achilles, Hephaestion laid his tribute at the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, beloved, and the other half of his soul. The message was quiet, but it echoed loud in myth. The symbolism was not lost on history. Were they just friends? Or was this Alexander's way of casting himself and Hephaestion as the new Achilles and Patroclus, warriors, soulmates, perhaps more? From that moment on, Alexander didn't just lead an army. He carried a legend on his shoulders. After Troy, the stories began to follow him. But Alexander didn't just walk in the footsteps of heroes, he was ready to outpace them. His next stop was Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia, once ruled by King Gordius, father of the famed Midas. Though now under Persian control, the city still pulsed with myth. In its heart stood a chariot, tied to a post with an impossible knot, a tangle so complex, no end or beginning could be found. According to prophecy, whoever could unravel the Gordian knot would go on to rule all of Asia. Alexander stepped forward. The crowd watched in silence. The rope was ancient, hardened by time and dust. He studied it, pulled at it, twisted it. Nothing. Then he stepped back and smiled. Without a word, he drew his sword and sliced the knot in half. The priests gasped. His generals whispered. And Alexander? He simply said, "It doesn't matter how it's untied." That moment wasn't just about prophecy. It was a statement. He wouldn't be bound by rules. Not of rope, not of kings, not even of fate. He would carve his own path, through knots, through armies, through empires. And Asia, as far as he was concerned, already belonged to him. The year was 333 BC. On the narrow plains of Issus, near the mountains and the sea, two worlds collided. On one side stood Alexander, barely 23 years old, commanding a smaller army of hardened Macedonians and restless Hellenes. On the other, Darius III, king of kings, ruler of the Persian Empire, with an army tens of thousands strong, stretching like a sea across the plain, and backed by centuries of imperial might. When the fighting began, the field became a storm of steel and screaming horses. Darius watched from a golden chariot, ornate, immobile, vulnerable. Alexander didn't wait. He led a direct cavalry charge, aiming not for glory, but for the king himself. The Persian lines broke. Darius turned and fled in a frenzy of fear, his golden chariot thundering away, leaving behind not just the battlefield, but his own mother, his queen, and his daughters to the mercy of the young conqueror. They were now prisoners, but Alexander treated them like royalty. When he entered their tent, he found them weeping, believing Darius had been killed. Alexander gently assured them he was alive, and then, in a moment that would echo through empires, he addressed Darius's mother as Mother. He forbade his men to touch them, or even speak to them without permission. He gave them private quarters, attendance, dignity. He treated them not as spoils of war, but as queens in waiting. It stunned the Persian nobility, and it won Alexander admiration in courts where he had once been cursed. That single act helped transform him into a rightful successor to Darius's imperial legacy. The myth deepened. Alexander the Just, Alexander the Merciful, a ruler of two worlds, east and west. After Issus, he was no longer just a conqueror. He was a force of fate, the pharaoh of two worlds. After Issus, Alexander turned south, toward the ancient land of Egypt. But this time there was no siege. The Persians had ruled Egypt, but they had never been loved. When Alexander entered in 332 BC, he was greeted not as an invader, but as a liberator. The temples opened, the people cheered, and the priests of Egypt did something extraordinary. They crowned him pharaoh in Memphis. It wasn't just a title. It meant he was a living god. Horus reborn, divine ruler of the Nile. The boy king of Macedon was now king of Upper and Lower Egypt. But Alexander wanted more than politics. He wanted answers about who he truly was. So he made a pilgrimage into the Libyan desert, to the sacred Siwa oasis, a place few dared cross. There, in the silence of the sand, stood the oracle of Ammon, the god the Greeks equated with Zeus himself. Only priests were allowed to hear the god's words. But when Alexander entered the shrine, the oracle welcomed him as a son of the god. What was said inside remains a mystery, but multiple ancient sources say that the oracle gave him a private message, which he never revealed. Then when he emerged from the oasis, Alexander was different. He believed the gods had confirmed what Olympias had whispered all along. He was not just born to rule. He was born touched by the gods, crowned in silence, anointed by prophecy, no longer merely mortal. He walked out of the desert as a god. To honor him, around the time of Alexander's visit, the Temple of Amun, later known as the Temple of Alexander the Great, was built. Dedicated to both the oracle of Amun and the god Horus, it stands today as a powerful reminder of their union and Alexander's legacy. Gaugamela, Assyrian satrapy, Persian Empire, 331 BC. If Isis proved he was a threat, Gaugamela would prove he was unstoppable. In 331 BC, on the vast plains near modern-day Iraq, Darius III made his final stand. This time, he brought everything: war elephants, scythed chariots, and an army that dwarfed Alexander's in sheer size. Over 200,000 troops, by some estimates, against Alexander's 47,000. The night before the battle, Darius prayed. Alexander slept. He wasn't just a general anymore. He was son of Zeus Ammon, a god king in his own mind, embraced by Egypt, crowned in Asia, and carried forward by fate. At dawn, the battlefield shimmered with dust and destiny. Darius waited behind his lines, safe, distant, gilded. Alexander led from the front. He executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, splitting his cavalry and punching a hole through the Persian line, aimed once again directly at Darius. And once again, Darius fled. The Persian army crumbled. The empire of Cyrus the Great, gone. With that victory, Alexander claimed the title King of Asia. He took Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the shining palace of Persia. And when he entered those cities, it wasn't as a foreign invader. It was as a man the East now whispered about in temples, the son of Ammon, the living god of war, the new king of kings. Love, power, and the hollow crown. After Gaugamela, the empire fell like ancient stone. In 330 BC, Darius III was dead, murdered by his own men as he fled into the east. Alexander found his body and wept. He ordered a royal funeral with full Persian honors, calling Darius his brother, his equal, the last king before him. With Darius gone, Alexander had no rival, and with no one left to fight, he began to change. He took over the Persian court in the same year. He dressed in Persian robes. He sat on the golden throne once built for Cyrus the Great. But still, Alexander was a king who refused to be boxed in by custom, especially when it came to love. In 327 BC, deep in the mountains of Bactria, he met Roxana, a noblewoman, barely more than a girl. According to legend, he married this woman who he fell for at first sight. She would bear him his only son, a boy born into shadows, destined to never see his parents again. Years later, in a different kind of ceremony, Alexander would take other wives for empire's sake, but only Roxana held his heart. His bond with Hephaestion was already legend, but at the Persian court, another male name entered the whispers: Bagoas, a beautiful eunuch and favored companion of the defeated king Darius III. In the Persian Empire, eunuchs were not merely servants. They were powerful, trusted, and often closer to kings than generals. And Bagoas, he was a political weapon dressed in perfume and silence. When Darius fell, most of his courtiers were exiled or executed, but Bagoas, barely 15, was spared, and in a move that shocked the court, he was presented to Alexander. Macedonian and Greek traditions generally viewed eunuchs with suspicion and associated them with Persian decadence. All eyes were on him, waiting for king's decision. And Alexander, breaking every Macedonian custom, accepted and since then kept Bagoas very close. To the court, it was unthinkable. To the army, it was strange. Was it a scandal? To some, yes. But Alexander didn't flinch. That same year, 324 BC, history remembers two public spectacles. One was strategic, the other scandalous. In the spring, at Susa, Alexander staged a grand political gesture. The mass weddings, where over 90 of his Macedonian officers married Persian noblewomen. Alexander himself took two wives, Statera II, daughter of Darius, and Parysatis, daughter of Artaxerxes. It was legacy dressed as ceremony, east and west bound by silk and vows, but in the autumn, something more personal unfolded. After leading his army through the brutal Gedrosian desert, losing thousands to thirst and heat, Alexander threw a wild celebration, the Carmanian Games. There were feasts, music, contests, and a dance competition. No one remembers the other dancers. Only Bagoas, the beautiful feminine eunuch in silks, whose body moved like wind over water. The soldiers, drunk on wine and survival, rose to their feet. They cheered, they laughed, they roared for the victor and called for a prize, for a kiss for the best dancer. And then they chanted, "Kiss him, kiss him." Historian Plutarch describes what followed. Still in his dancer's robes, Bagoas crossed the theater and sat beside the king. The crowd clapped, stamped their feet, shouted louder. Alexander, just as drunk, just as defiant, gave them what they asked for. He kissed Bagoas publicly, in full view of his court and generals. Without hesitation, without shame. In front of them all, not caring about how scandalous it was. History remembers that Bagoas remained at Alexander's side until the end. Yet not all who came to Susa would leave again. Among the guests was Kalanos, a revered Indian philosopher and ascetic who had traveled west with Alexander's entourage. Too ill to continue the journey, Kalanos chose to end his life in the Indian way, by ritual self-immolation. As he approached the flames, he turned to Alexander and said, "We shall meet again in Babylon." At the time it was poetic, but ancient writers like Plutarch and Arrian would later see it as an eerie prophecy, or perhaps a curse, the death that broke a god. In the autumn of 324 BC, just months after the Susa weddings, Hephaestion fell ill. Suddenly, violently. Some said it was fever. Others blamed tainted food. But within days, he was gone. Alexander collapsed. He stayed beside Hephaestion's body, refusing food, refusing comfort. For days, he neither spoke nor moved. His closest companion, his shadow in battle, his echo in silence, gone. The grief was not quiet. He cut his hair in mourning, just as Achilles did for Patroclus. He executed the doctor who failed to save him. He banned music in the empire. And he ordered a funeral so vast it rivaled the death of kings. Hephaestion was declared a god. Shrines were built, Statues raised. Alexander demanded he be worshipped across the empire. And for the first time, people whispered, not about Alexander's ambition, but about his suffering. The man who had conquered nations now seemed lost in his own kingdom. The son of Zeus, brought to his knees by love. And from that moment on, something in Alexander began to fade. He pushed forward, he fought more battles, but the spark, the fire, was burning out. By 323 BC, Alexander was just 32 years old, but he had conquered more of the known world than anyone in history. His empire stretched from Greece to Egypt, from Babylon to the edges of India, but something in him had dimmed since Hephaestion's death. The rituals were grander, the silences longer. The man who once ran naked around a tomb in Troy now rarely smiled. He became harder to reach, more marble than man. The boy who once chased myths now seemed to believe he had become one. Whispers of betrayal haunted his court, and suspicion became law. Alexander began executing generals and governors for perceived disloyalty. Even Callisthenes, his historian, his storyteller, was put to death for refusing to bow, for denying that Alexander was a god. Those who once praised him were now measured by how loudly they did so. The ancient historian Quintus Curtius Rufus would later write, "He no longer ruled like a general among friends, but like a despot among subjects. No one stood beyond the shadow of his doubt." It was late spring 323 BC. Alexander entered Babylon, against all warnings. The Chaldean priests had pleaded with him not to come. The omens were dire. The stars were misaligned. They urged him to wait or enter from another gate. But Alexander had just returned from the ends of the known world, from India, from deserts that had swallowed armies. He had plans, a new campaign. Arabia was next, and Babylon, rich, ancient, sacred, was to be his new capital. The heart of an empire without limits, so he dismissed the priests, as he often had. He believed his destiny was beyond the reach of superstition, and so he rode in, through the gate of Ishtar, at the head of a column that stretched for miles. A grand military review. Soldiers, war elephants, horses, musicians. A spectacle carved from glory. It was meant to remind the world who he was. But to some, it looked like a farewell. A god walking among mortals, already half gone. And then came new omens. A man, mad or cursed, found sitting on Alexander's throne, dragged away screaming and later executed. 2 ravens locked in violent combat over the palace gates. A lion wandered into the city and died. The skies were hot and heavy, the air held its breath, and within days, Alexander began to burn with fever. That summer in the city of Babylon, Alexander fell ill. The symptoms came swiftly: fever, pain, weakness, delirium. His generals watched, helpless, as their god-king faded before their eyes. For 12 days he burned. He could no longer speak. He could no longer move. But according to some, he could still hear. Some said his eyes were open, glassy, distant, but aware. Others swore they followed movement across the room. When asked, "To whom does the empire go?" Alexander reportedly whispered, "To the strongest." But others say he only looked to Perdiccas, one of his most trusted generals, who was then handed the royal signet ring, before anyone declared him dead. No physician dared speak first, and to this day, no one knows who said the words, "The king is dead." But they believed he was truly gone. His body was laid out publicly for all to see, so the empire could grieve their fallen god. His body did not decompose. For 6 days, in the sweltering Babylonian heat, his skin remained untouched by death. No odor, no bloating, no decay. The Greeks said it was proof of his divinity. Others whispered something darker. Was he still alive? Modern scholars believe he may have entered a deep coma, or worse, a locked-in state, fully conscious, unable to move or cry out. A leading theory, supported by medical historians, points to Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that can paralyze the body while the mind stays fully awake. If true, it means something unthinkable. Alexander the Great may have been buried alive, the greatest conqueror in history, entombed in silence. We'll look closer at this theory at the end of the video. As Alexander the Great's empire fractured, blood followed prophecy. His wives were assassinated in the shadows that followed his death. Roxana and his young heir, Alexander IV, were held in the fortress of Amphipolis. 13 years after the fall of the great king, mother and son were quietly poisoned. No heir remained. No bloodline left to challenge the scramble for his fractured empire, and yet, he was remembered forever. Even as the empire vanished, his name remained, etched in marble, marked on maps, carried in myth. And somewhere in the desert winds, Kalanos's final words still hang in the air. We shall meet again in Babylon. Bonus: the final mystery. Earlier we mentioned a chilling theory, that Alexander may not have died when they thought he did. Now, let's look at it through the lens of modern medical knowledge. Some neurologists believe he suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune disorder that causes complete paralysis. No movement, no speech, no visible signs of life, but the mind remains fully alert. Why would anybody think that? In the searing heat of Babylon, that illusion of stillness could have sealed his fate, making him appear dead, while still very much alive. Remember, the medicine of that time was on a very different level, and they didn't have the options of monitoring vitals and the brain activity as we have today. He was reportedly embalmed and placed in a golden sarcophagus. As you are probably aware, embalming in the ancient world wasn't gentle. It meant opening the torso, removing organs, acts that would have been fatal if done to someone still conscious, which would also mean that he was not buried alive. If true, his death wouldn't have been from illness. It would have come from the ritual itself. There's no physical evidence to confirm this. It's the combination of ancient descriptions, the medical theory, and the gap between death and burial has left one haunting possibility. The greatest conqueror in history may have been embalmed alive, and his tomb still missing. Though he was reportedly buried in Alexandria and visited by emperors like Caesar, Augustus, and Caligula, by the 3rd or 4th century, his tomb vanished from the historical record, possibly lost to earthquakes, floods, or time itself. To this day, Alexander's final resting place has never been found. Somewhere beneath the sand, or the city, or maybe still waiting beneath history. If you like the story, please subscribe, like, and comment. Keep questioning the past, because sometimes the truth is even stranger than the myth.